This wasn't just any auction, it was the event where reputations were made and fortunes displayed. But the moment Raymond Foster walked through those ornate doors in his threadbare coat, all eyes turned to judge the man who clearly didn't belong. What they couldn't see was that their biggest mistake wasn't letting him in. It would be trying to force him out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackwell Auction House stood like a temple to wealth and culture in the heart of London's Mayfair district. Its neo-classical facade, meticulously restored to Victorian perfection, loomed over the rain-slicked streets as black luxury cars deposited passengers at its illuminated entrance. Doormen in burgundy livery rushed forward with large umbrellas, ensuring not a drop of London rain touched the arriving guests. Inside, the grand hall hummed with the sophisticated murmur of cultivated voices. Diamond-adorned wrists lifted delicate hors d'oeuvres, while security personnel, dressed in impeccable suits nearly indistinguishable from those worn by the guests, maintained a watchful presence at every corner. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors, so polished they reflected the wealth that walked upon them. Tonight was the annual Blackwell Winter Auction, where pieces from private collections rarely seen by the public would change hands for sums that could fund small nations. The catalogue was whispered to include a previously unknown Monet, verified just months ago and already valued at 8 figures. Art dealers, old money families, newly minted tech billionaires, and representatives from prestigious museums around the world had flown in specifically for tonight. Darling, did you see Lady Harrington's face when Phillips announced they'd secured the Whitmore collection? A woman in a midnight blue gown leaned close to her companion, pearl earrings catching the light as she gestured with her champagne glass. Complete devastation. Her foundation has been after those pieces for years. Business as usual, her companion replied with practiced nonchalance, though I hear Somerset is particularly determined about Lot 47. Apparently, his grandfather once owned it before it was acquired by the Germans during the occupation of France. He's quite sentimental about reclaiming family legacy. Near the main display, where the evening's featured pieces were arranged under perfect lighting and discreet security sensors, Countess Valeska Karnstein from Vienna examined a rare Byzantine icon through her lorgnette. The provenance is impeccable, she pronounced to no one in particular, though her voice carried just enough to ensure several people heard her expert assessment. The Countess was known for her ruthless bidding strategy and her collection of religious art that rivaled many museums. Tonight, she wore her trademark blood-red lipstick and a vintage Dior gown that predated most of the attendees' interest in fine art. One wonders why the Hermitage would part with such a treasure, remarked Harold Winfield Hayes, a museum director from New York, who had positioned himself within the Countess's orbit. Financial pressures, I imagine. Such a shame when institutions must sell their souls. The Countess's smile was razor-thin. Perhaps, Harold. Not everyone recognizes the true value of what they possess. Their loss shall be someone's gain tonight. Sebastian. Blackwell, the auction house's owner and a third-generation curator of fine arts, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. His tailored Savile Row suit, platinum cufflinks, and the antique pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather completed an image of old money sophistication. Each greeting was precisely calibrated to its recipient, warmer for the bigger spenders, respectfully distant for the merely wealthy, and coolly dismissive of those whose budgets would barely cover the evening's lower-tier offerings. "The Pissarro is exquisite," commented Arabella Montrose, heiress to a shipping fortune and a board member of the National Gallery. "Though I worry the estimate is ambitious, even for your clientele, Sebastian." "Quality finds its price, Arabella," Sebastian replied smoothly. Besides, when one purchases a Pissarro, one isn't merely buying canvas and oil, but a piece of history, a tangible connection to genius. "How poetic," Arabella said with a laugh that tinkled like ice in crystal. "One might think you're the one paying for it, rather than extracting your 15% commission." Sebastian merely smiled. These verbal fencing matches were part of the evening's entertainment. "Mr. Blackwell," called out William Hastings, a tech billionaire new to the art world but eager to establish himself. "Magnificent evening as always. I'm particularly interested in the Japanese prints." "Ah, yes," Sebastian replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "A discerning choice. Though I believe lots 30 through 35 have already attracted considerable interest from the Tokyo National Museum. Perhaps I could direct you towards something more accessible for a new collector." The Americana section has several charming pieces that might suit your developing taste. The subtle barb, delivered with such polished charm that it almost sounded like genuine advice, sent a ripple of concealed amusement through those close enough to overhear. This was how status was maintained in rooms like this, not through outright confrontation, but through velvet-wrapped dismissals and hierarchies so entrenched they seemed as natural as breathing. In the corner, Dominic Winters, a renowned arty, critic whose reviews could make or break careers, watched the social dynamics with thinly veiled disdain. He sipped his champagne slowly, cataloguing each interaction, each subtle display of power. Tomorrow's column already taking shape in his mind, the winter auction, where art takes second place to artifice. "Your usual spot is reserved in the front row," whispered Alessandra, Sebastian's personal assistant. Her voice was just loud enough for nearby guests to overhear, another calculated move in the complex social chess game. "You're a treasure, my dear," Dominic replied. "And how is our esteemed host's blood pressure this evening? The Degas fiasco at Christie's last month must still sting." Alessandra's professional smile never wavered. "Mr. Blackwell is in excellent spirits. After all, tonight's catalogue speaks for itself. The soft chime of a silver bell indicated that guests should begin taking their seats. Auction paddles were distributed discreetly to pre-approved bidders whose finances had been thoroughly vetted. The staff, trained to be simultaneously invisible and instantly available, guided attendees toward the rows of elegant chairs facing the auction podium. At the podium, Malcolm Reed, the evening's auctioneer and a legendary figure in the art world, adjusted his bow tie. His reputation for extracting record-breaking bids through a combination of wit, gentle coercion, and strategic pauses was unmatched. He had presided over the sale of some of the most significant artworks of the past 3 decades and knew exactly how to play a room full of egos and checkbooks. Everything was proceeding exactly as it had for over a century of Blackwell auctions, until the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, admitting a gust of cold air and the most unexpected guest of the evening. A collective hush fell over the grand hall as Raymond Foster stepped through the doorway. The 60-something man stood in stark contrast to everything and everyone in the Blackwell Auction House. Where the room gleamed with polished opulence, Raymond was weathered and worn. His grey hair, longer than fashion, dictated and loosely, tied at the nape of his neck, framed a face mapped with lines that spoke of outdoor labor rather than cosmetic treatments. His hands, visible as he removed a pair of worn leather gloves, were calloused and marked with old scars, the hands of someone who had built things, fixed things, worked with materials more substantial than stock portfolios or digital assets. But it was his clothing that truly marked him as an outsider. Raymond wore an old tweed coat with leather patches at the elbows, frayed slightly at the cuffs. Beneath it, a flannel shirt in faded blue, clean but clearly well used. His trousers were simple brown corduroy, ending at sturdy work boots that had seen better days, not the handmade Italian leather adorning every other foot in the room. The only concession to formality was a simple knit tie, slightly askew, as if he had tied it from memory rather than practice. In one hand he clutched a battered leather messenger bag, its surface cracked and burnished from years of use. In the other, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, which he carefully returned to his coat pocket as he surveyed the room. The conversations that had filled the hall seconds before, now reduced to whispers and pointed glances. Sebastian Blackwell, still mid-conversation with an important client, froze momentarily before his features rearranged themselves into the practiced mask of someone accustomed to handling uncomfortable situations. "If you'll excuse me," he murmured to his companion before making his way toward the intruder with measured steps. Raymond seemed oblivious to the stir he had caused. His pale blue eyes, remarkably clear and sharp despite his age, scanned the room methodically, taking in the artwork, the people, the atmosphere with quiet assessment. When his gaze met the approaching figure of Sebastian Blackwell, he didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he straightened slightly, squaring shoulders that suggested he had once been a more physically imposing man before age had begun its inevitable reshaping. "Good evening," Raymond said, his voice carrying a hint of regional accent, northern working class entirely out of place among the cultured tones surrounding him. "Good evening, sir," Sebastian replied, his voice pitched to be heard by those nearby. "Welcome to Blackwell's. I'm afraid the public viewing was yesterday afternoon. Tonight is our invitation-only auction event." The implication was clear. "You don't have an invitation. You don't belong here." "I'm aware of what tonight is," Raymond answered, seemingly unperturbed by the subtle dismissal. "I've come for the auction." A few feet away, Lady Diana Wexford Hayes raised a perfectly manicured hand to cover her mouth as she whispered to her companion, "Did he walk in from a jumble sale? Security must be slipping." The whisper was just loud enough to carry as intended. A ripple of titters spread through the nearest clusters of guests. Sebastian's smile remained frozen in place. "I see. And your name, sir, for our guest list?" "Raymond Foster." Sebastian gestured discreetly, and Alessandra materialized at his side. Tablet in hand, she tapped the screen several times, her crimson nail polish flashing under the chandelier light. "I don't see a Mr. Foster on our list of registered bidders," she said, her tone professional but cool. "I registered this morning by telephone," Raymond replied. "Spoke to a young man named Daniel. Quite helpful, he was." Alessandra's composure flickered momentarily. Daniel was indeed their newest staff member in the client relations department. "Let me check the late registrations," she said, her fingers moving across the screen with increased urgency. The awkward silence stretched as Sebastian maintained his polite smile, and Raymond stood still, apparently content to wait. Around them, the auction's guests had given up all pretense of not watching the unfolding scene. "Ah, here it is," Alessandra finally said, her voice betraying a hint of surprise. "Mr. Raymond Foster, late registration approved by Mr. Carlton." She looked up at Sebastian, a silent query in her eyes. Carlton was the finance director, someone who only approved the most financially qualified bidders. Sebastian's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, Mr. Foster, we are pleased to welcome you to Blackwell's. Alessandra will show you to your seat and provide you with a bidding paddle." "Thank you kindly," Raymond said with a slight nod. "But first, I'd like to view Lot 37 more. Closely, if I may." "Lot 37?" Sebastian repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. Lot 37 was the crown jewel of the evening, the previously unknown Monet landscape, Twilight on the Seine, discovered in an attic in Normandy last year and authenticated after months of painstaking analysis. Its estimated value started at £12 million. "Yes," Raymond confirmed simply. "I've come a long way to see it. From the corner of his eye, Sebastian could see Dominic Winters, the art critic, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. This was exactly the kind of social drama Winters lived to document in his acerbic columns. "Of course," Sebastian said smoothly, "though I should inform you that there has been significant interest in this particular piece. The bidding is expected to be competitive." What he meant was clear to everyone listening. "This is beyond your means." "I expect it will be," Raymond agreed, seemingly missing, or perhaps deliberately ignoring the implication. As Alessandra led Raymond toward the display where the Monet was secured behind discreet reinforced glass, the whispers intensified. "Who on earth is he?" demanded Arabella Montrose, not bothering to lower her voice. "Some northern factory owner, perhaps," suggested William Hastings. "New money trying to climb the social ladder. Whatever he is, he's delusional if he thinks he can." "Compete for the Monet," said Harold Winfield Hayes, with a dismissive snort. "The Guggenheim has already authorized me to go to 14 million, and I know the Countess's limits are even higher." The Countess herself remained silent, watching Raymond with narrowed eyes as he approached the painting. Unlike the others, she reserved judgment, having learned through decades in the art world that appearances could be deceiving. Raymond stood before the Monet, his weathered face illuminated by the careful lighting designed to showcase the masterpiece. For several long moments, he simply looked, his expression unreadable. Then, to the surprise of those watching, he removed a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, not designer frames, but simple wire-rimmed spectacles, and leaned in to examine the delicate brushwork more closely. "Sir," cautioned the security guard stationed nearby, "please maintain a respectful distance from the artwork." "No harm meant," Raymond said, straightening and tucking his glasses away. "Just admiring the technique. Monet had a special way with light, didn't he? Makes you feel like you're there, watching the sun set over the Seine." The comment, surprisingly educated for someone of his appearance, caused several onlookers to exchange glances. "Are you an art enthusiast, Mr. Foster?" asked Dominic Winters, who had drifted closer, unable to resist the journalistic opportunity. Raymond turned to face the critic, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate beautiful things," he said simply. "Always have." "And what brings you to our auction tonight? The Monet specifically?" Winters pressed, eyes gleaming with the scent of a story. Raymond reached into his pocket and once again touched the yellowed newspaper clipping he had been holding earlier. "Let's just say I have my reasons." Before Winters could probe further, the silver bell chimed again, more insistently this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The auction will commence in 5 minutes, announced the auctioneer from the podium. Alessandra gestured toward an empty chair in the back row. "Your seat, Mr. Foster." Raymond smiled faintly. "Thank you, miss. That will do nicely." As he moved toward his assigned place, noticeably distant from the premium seating reserved for serious collectors, a path cleared before him. The well-heeled crowd parted, as if his workman's clothes might somehow stain their designer attire, their expressions ranging from amusement to disdain to outright curiosity. Sebastian Blackwell, watching from across the room, pulled Carlton, the finance director, aside. "What exactly made you approve this man's registration?" he asked in a low voice. Carlton, a silver-haired man with the perpetually worried expression of someone who spends his days dealing with vast sums of money, shrugged uncomfortably. He provided bank confirmation of available funds, substantial funds. "I had no grounds to refuse." "Did you verify the bank's authenticity? This could be some kind of stunt, an activist making a statement about wealth inequality or some such nonsense. We've had incidents before." "It's Coutts, Sebastian," Carlton replied, naming one of Britain's most exclusive private banks. "I spoke with the branch manager personally. The funds are real." Sebastian frowned. Raymond Foster, now seated at the back of the hall, looked entirely out of place amid the wealthy collectors. Yet he sat with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees as he surveyed the room. "Keep an eye on him," Sebastian instructed. "If he's some northern businessman who struck it lucky and thinks he can buy his way into this world, he's in for a rude awakening. The Monet will go for far more than its estimate." What Sebastian couldn't know, as he took his own seat in the front row, was that Raymond Foster had not come to be accepted into their world. He had come to reclaim something from it, something worth far more to him than money or social standing could ever be. Malcolm Reed tapped his gavel gently against the podium, bringing the room to attention. The auctioneer's voice, cultivated over decades to project both authority and charm, filled the grand hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Blackwell Winter Auction. We have an exceptional catalogue for you this evening, with 73 lots representing some of the finest examples of European, Asian, and contemporary art to come to market this season." As Malcolm began with the formalities, Raymond Foster sat quietly in his back row seat, seemingly oblivious to the stares and whispers that continued to circulate around him. 2 seats away, a woman in an emerald evening gown had pointedly moved, herself farther from him, as if his worn tweed might somehow contaminate her designer silk. On his other side, a gap of 3 empty chairs separated him from a group of younger collectors who kept glancing in his direction before dissolving into poorly concealed laughter. "Look at those boots," one whispered, not bothering to lower his voice sufficiently. "Do you think he walked here from Scotland?" "Perhaps he's the janitor," another suggested, "and simply forgot tonight was the auction. More likely he's someone's gardener who got the wrong invitation," added a third, this comment triggering another round of snickering. Raymond showed no reaction to their comments. His attention remained fixed on the auctioneer and the first lot now being presented, a minor Degas sketch expected to sell for around $80,000. From his position at the side of the room, Sebastian Blackwell continued to observe the unusual guest with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Despite Carlton's assurances about the man's financial credentials, something felt off. In Sebastian's 20 years running the auction house, he had developed an instinct for people who belonged in his world, and Raymond Foster did not fit any pattern he recognized. "I want security to stay close," he murmured to Alessandra. "If he makes any trouble, have him removed immediately." "On what grounds?" she asked, ever practical. "He's a registered bidder with verified funds." "I'm sure we can find something if necessary," Sebastian replied. "Just keep eyes on him." Across the room, Dominic Winters was having similar thoughts about Raymond Foster, though from a different angle. The art critic's interest was piqued not by concern, but by journalistic instinct. In a room full of predictable players behaving exactly as expected, Foster was the only element of mystery, and therefore the only potentially interesting story. As the first few lots were efficiently sold, mostly to expected buyers at prices near the published estimates, Winters observed that Foster made no move to raise his paddle. He simply watched, his expression attentive but revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Lot 8, announced Malcolm Reed. "A Fabergé silver gilt and enamel photograph frame, Moscow, circa 1890. From the collection of Lady Margaret Pembroke. We'll start the bidding at $20,000. The woman in the emerald gown, who had distanced herself from Raymond, immediately raised her paddle. $20,000, from Mrs. Hargreaves. "Do I see $25,000? Another paddle went up. $25,000 from Mr. Lefebvre. $30,000? Mrs. Hargreaves nodded, and the bidding quickly escalated. At $50,000, most bidders had dropped out, leaving only Mrs. Hargreaves and a telephone bidder represented by one of the Blackwell staff against the far wall. $85,000 from the telephone. "Mrs. Hargreaves, do I see $90,000? The woman hesitated, then reluctantly raised her paddle once more. $90,000 in the room. Do I hear $95,000? The Blackwell staff member nodded after listening to his headset. 95,000 on the telephone. Against you, Mrs. Hargreaves, at $95,000. The woman's face tightened with frustration. She was clearly approaching her limit. 100,000, she said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. 100,000 in the room. Do I hear 110,000? After a pause, the staff member shook his head. No further bid from the telephone. Very well. Selling at $100,000 to Mrs. Hargreaves. Congratulations, madam. As the auction continued through the early lots, Raymond remained still. His bidding, paddle untouched on his lap, his apparent lack of interest in anything that wasn't Lot 37, the Monet, confirmed what many in the room had already concluded. He was in over his head, perhaps realizing too late that Blackwell's was far beyond his means. Probably saving his pennies for a hopeless bid on the Monet, Lord Harrington commented to Sebastian during a brief pause between lots. Rather sad, really. Does he think this is like those television programs where ordinary people discover treasures in their attics? Quite, Sebastian agreed with a thin smile. Though I admit I'm curious what brought him here. Carlton insists his funds are legitimate. New cryptocurrency wealth, perhaps, suggested Harrington. All these tech types with their digital fortunes, no breeding, no taste, but suddenly flush with cash. Sebastian nodded, though privately he doubted that was the case. Raymond Foster didn't have the eager, status-seeking demeanor of the newly rich. There was something else in his bearing, a quiet certainty that Sebastian found increasingly irritating. As Lot 15 concluded, a Qing dynasty jade carving that went to the Countess after a brief but intense bidding war, one of the security staff approached Sebastian and whispered something in his ear. Sebastian's expression darkened. "Excuse me," he said to Lord Harrington, before following the security guard to the rear of the hall. In the small antechamber behind the auction room, another security guard stood with a young woman in a simple black dress. She looked nervous, but determined. "Mr. Blackwell," the guard began, "this woman was attempting to enter the auction without credentials. She claims to be with Mr. Foster." "I'm his granddaughter," the woman explained, her voice carrying the same northern accent as Raymond's, though softened by education. "Claire Foster. I was delayed by train problems from Cambridge. My grandfather should have registered me as his guest." Sebastian studied her with undisguised skepticism. She was in her mid-20s, with intelligent eyes and a composed demeanor, despite her obvious discomfort at being detained. While her clothing was modest compared to the auction clientele, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Mr. Foster made no mention of a guest," Sebastian said coolly. "And our registration process is quite strict. I'm afraid I can't allow you to enter without proper verification." "Please, just ask him," Claire insisted. "I've been trying to reach him, but he never remembers to keep his mobile phone turned on." "The auction is in progress and cannot be disturbed," Sebastian replied. "If you'd like to wait, perhaps we can sort this out after the event concludes." What he didn't say was that having one oddity in his auction was quite enough. The last thing he needed was another Foster disrupting his carefully orchestrated evening. "It's important that I join him," Claire pressed. "The Monet is not scheduled for auction until much later this evening," Sebastian interrupted. "If, as you claim, you're only here for that particular lot, you have ample time to have your credentials verified." Claire's expression hardened slightly. "I see. And where exactly am I supposed to wait? In the street, perhaps?" Sebastian signaled to Alessandra, who had appeared silently at his side. "My assistant will show you to our waiting area. We can attempt to confirm your identity with Mr. Foster during the next intermission, which should be in approximately 40 minutes. As Alessandra led Claire away, Sebastian returned to the auction room, his irritation growing. The Foster situation was becoming an unwelcome distraction on what should have been a straightforward and highly profitable evening. Back in the Grand Hall, the auction had progressed to Lot 23. Raymond remained in his seat, still, watchful, still silent. If he was concerned about his granddaughter's absence, he showed no sign of it. "He hasn't bid on a single item," Mrs. Hargreaves whispered to her companion as Sebastian passed their row. "What kind of game is he playing?" Sebastian wished he knew. The more he observed Raymond Foster, the more convinced he became that the man had some agenda beyond simple participation in the auction. Was he a journalist working on an exposé, a disgruntled former client, or perhaps related to one of the sellers, there to ensure their property reached an appropriate price? Malcolm Reed announced a brief pause in the proceedings before they moved to the next section of lots. As attendees began to stand and stretch, Sebastian made his way toward Raymond. "Mr. Foster," he said, his tone professionally cordial despite his misgivings. "I trust you're finding the auction interesting, even if nothing has caught your eye thus far." Raymond looked up at him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Everything's going just as expected, Mr. Blackwell. Your auction house has a fine reputation." "Indeed. Speaking of expectations, there's a young woman claiming to be your granddaughter attempting to join the proceedings. A Miss Claire Foster. She says you were meant to register her as your guest." A flicker of emotion, the first Sebastian had seen, crossed Raymond's weathered face. "Claire's here. She wasn't sure she could make it up from Cambridge in time, so you confirm she is your granddaughter?" "Of course she is. Where have you put her?" There was a sudden steel in Raymond's voice that took Sebastian aback. "She's waiting, uncomfortably in our client lounge," he replied smoothly. "I'll have someone bring her in right away, now that you've confirmed her identity." "See that you do," Raymond said, and there was no mistaking the command in his tone. "She should be here for this." As Sebastian turned to signal Alessandra, he was stopped by Harold Winfield Hayes, the museum director from New York. "Sebastian, a word?" Harold's expression was troubled. "There's some rather disturbing chatter circulating about your unusual guest." "What sort of chatter?" Sebastian asked, immediately alert. "Word is, he's here representing the Foster family from Manchester. Old textile fortune that went bust in the 70s. If it's the same Fosters, and the age would be about right, there was quite the scandal involving art that went missing during liquidation." Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting he's connected to stolen artwork?" Harold shrugged. "I'm not suggesting anything, just passing along what I've heard, though it does make one wonder why he's so fixated on the Monet." As Claire was escorted into the auction room and made her way to her grandfather's side, Sebastian watched them embrace briefly, their family resemblance now obvious in the similar set of their eyes and the line of their jaws. They spoke in hushed tones, Raymond's expression growing more serious as Claire spoke urgently to him. Whatever game the Fosters were playing, Sebastian was now certain of one thing. Raymond Foster had not come to Blackwell simply to admire the art. He had come with a purpose, and that purpose somehow centered on Lot 37, the Monet that was the pride of tonight's auction. Sebastian returned to his position as Malcolm Reed prepared to resume the auction. He caught the auctioneer's eye and gave a slight nod. The message was clear. Watch the Fosters carefully. As the gavel came down once more, the tension in the Grand Hall had subtly shifted. What had begun as simple disdain for an outsider had evolved into something more complex, a sense of impending disruption to the carefully ordered world of Blackwell's that no one could quite define, but everyone could feel approaching like distant thunder. Lot 29, a bronze sculpture after Rodin, the thinker, early 20th century casting with verified provenance. Will begin the bidding at $140,000. Malcolm Reed's practiced cadence filled the Grand Hall as the auction progressed through its middle section. The rhythm of bid and counterbid had settled into a predictable pattern, with most items going to expected buyers, established collectors, museum representatives, or wealthy patrons looking to enhance their private collections. Raymond and Claire Foster remained in their back row seats, occasionally exchanging quiet words that no one else could hear. Their presence had become a sort of background curiosity for most attendees, though Sebastian Blackwell continued to watch them with undisguised suspicion. The information Harold Winfield Hayes had shared troubled him deeply. If Raymond Foster was indeed connected to the Manchester textile family, that raised uncomfortable questions about his interest in tonight's auction. The Foster mills had once been among the largest in northern England, employing thousands before their spectacular collapse in the late 1970s. Sebastian vaguely recalled his father mentioning the scandal, something about assets being undervalued during liquidation, including an art collection that had seemingly vanished overnight. But what could that possibly have to do with tonight's Monet? Twilight on the Seine had impeccable provenance, tracing back to the original owner who had purchased it directly from the artist. It had passed through only 3 hands before being forgotten in that Normandy attic, where it had remained untouched for decades until last year's discovery, unless a troubling thought occurred to Sebastian. He gestured to Alessandra, who immediately approached. "I need you to double-check the provenance records for Lot 37, he whispered. "Specifically, look for any connection to the Foster family of Manchester or their textile business. Now." "But the auction—" "Now, Alessandra," Sebastian insisted, "and discreetly." As Alessandra slipped away to carry out this task, Sebastian noticed Dominic Winters making his way toward the Fosters. The critic had clearly decided they were the most interesting story in the room tonight. Sebastian couldn't allow Winters to stir up more complications. He intercepted him halfway. "Dominic," Sebastian said with a tight smile, "how are you finding the selections this evening?" "Predictable for the most part," Winters replied with his characteristic bluntness, "though I must say your northern guest is by far the most intriguing element of the night. Care to share what you know about him? Mr. Foster is a private client, and we respect the privacy of all our clients." "Come now, Sebastian." A man dressed like a factory foreman walks into Blackwell's, brings along his granddaughter, hasn't bid on a single item, but is apparently fixated on your star lot. "That's not just a private client, that's a story. Whatever story you think you've found, I suggest you wait until after the auction concludes before pursuing it," Sebastian said firmly. "We value the integrity of our proceedings." Winters smiled, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "The integrity of the proceedings, or the smoothness of your profit margins? Don't worry, Sebastian. I'll behave myself. For now." Before Sebastian could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Victor Harrington, Lord Harrington's son and well known in London society for both his family's wealth and his own volatile temperament, had arrived late and apparently intoxicated. His face was flushed, his movements unsteady as he made his way down the center aisle, nodding to acquaintances with exaggerated formality. Sebastian suppressed a groan. Victor's behavior at previous events had occasionally bordered on the inappropriate, but he was the son of one of Blackwell's most valuable clients. Publicly rebuking him was not an option. Unfortunately, Victor's path to his reserved seat took him directly past Raymond and Claire Foster. He paused, swaying slightly, and stared at Raymond with undisguised curiosity. "What's this, then?" he asked loudly, interrupting Malcolm Reed mid-description of the current lot. "Someone's grandfather wander in from the street?" Uncomfortable hush fell over the room. Malcolm paused, his professional demeanor momentarily thrown by the interruption. "Victor," Sebastian said, moving quickly to intervene, "your father's been saving you a seat. Let me show you—" No, I'm genuinely curious," Victor continued, his words slightly slurred, but clear enough to carry throughout the hall. "We've—" Got the elite of the art world here tonight, and then this. He gestured at Raymond with a dismissive wave. Rather brings down the tone, doesn't it? Claire Foster straightened in her seat, her expression darkening, but Raymond placed a restraining hand on her arm. His own face remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something more complex and perhaps more dangerous. "Young man," Raymond said quietly, "you're interrupting the proceedings." Victor laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the hushed atmosphere of the auction room. "I'm interrupting? That's rich. You're the one who doesn't belong here, old man. What are you bidding on tonight? A new pair of boots?" Sebastian had reached Victor's side by now and took his arm firmly. "That's enough, Victor. Mr. Foster is a registered bidder and a guest of Blackwell's." "Is he really?" Victor's tone was incredulous. "And what exactly does he think he's going to buy? The tea trolley?" From the front row, Lord Harrington half rose from his seat. "Victor, sit down at once," he hissed, his face flushed with embarrassment. But Victor, emboldened by alcohol and the nervous laughter from some of the younger attendees, was not to be deterred. He shook off Sebastian's hand and took a step closer to Raymond. "Let me guess," he said, leaning down so his face was level with Raymond's. "You've come to bid on the big Monet? Planning to hang it in your council flat, are you?" Claire Foster stood abruptly, her patience clearly exhausted. "You have no idea who you're speaking to," she said, her voice quiet but intense. "My grandfather has more right to be here than—" "Claire." Raymond's single word stopped her. His tone was gentle, but firm. "It's all right." He turned his gaze back to Victor, and something in that steady blue stare made the younger man's smirk falter slightly. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Raymond said evenly. "Raymond Foster." "Victor Harrington," came the reply, delivered, with the automatic hauteur of someone who expects his name to carry weight. "Well, Mr. Harrington, you're correct about one thing. I'm indeed interested in the Monet. Beyond that, I think we'll both benefit from you returning to your seat so the auction can continue." There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a moment of unexpected gravity from the old man in worn tweed that seemed to cut through Victor's alcohol-fueled bravado. For a second, it appeared the confrontation might end there, but Victor, perhaps sensing he had lost the upper hand in some indefinable way, doubled down. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice rising again. "I think you're having us on. You'd think this is some kind of publicity stunt." He turned to address the room at large. "What is this? Some reality television program? Pensioners' antique adventure?" More laughter rippled through the room, though now tinged with discomfort. Malcolm Reed tapped his gavel, attempting to restore order. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we have several important lots yet to present." Sebastian, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, made a decision. He signaled to security, who began moving discreetly toward the back of the room. "Victor, either take your seat or I'll have to ask you to leave," he said in a low voice. "You're disrupting the auction." "I'm disrupting it?" Victor laughed again. "What about him?" He jabbed a finger toward Raymond. "You want class, Sebastian? This isn't it. My father's been coming to Blackwell's for 30 years. We've spent millions here, and now you're letting in anyone off the street." Two security guards had reached their position now, standing at a respectful distance, but clearly ready to intervene. Lord Harrington had also made his way down the aisle, his expression thunderous. "Victor, that is enough," he growled. "You're embarrassing yourself and our family name." "Actually," Raymond said, rising slowly to his feet, "your son raises a fair question." The room went completely still. Even Victor seemed startled by Raymond's calm intervention. "What right do I have to be here?" Raymond continued, his voice clear and steady. "By appearance alone, I clearly don't match the usual Blackwell's clientele. I'm not wearing the right clothes. I don't speak with the right accent. I haven't bid on anything yet." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had been whispering about him all evening. so perhaps it's time I explained myself. Sebastian tensed. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid. A scene that would disrupt his carefully orchestrated auction and potentially impact the bidding on their star lot. "Mr. Foster, that's really not necessary," he began. "Mr. Harrington is not speaking for Blackwell's." "Nevertheless," Raymond replied, "I think some context might help." Before he could continue, Alessandra appeared at Sebastian's side, her face pale. She whispered urgently in his ear, and Sebastian's expression changed from irritation to alarm. "Mr. Foster," he said quickly, his tone now brittle with forced politeness, "perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. We have a comfortable office just behind the auction room." Raymond studied Sebastian's face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "After you," he said. As Sebastian led Raymond and Claire toward the rear exit, he signaled to Malcolm to continue with the auction. Victor, now firmly in his father's grip, was being guided to his seat, the momentary drama apparently concluded. But throughout the room, the mood had shifted. The confrontation had brought the underlying tension to the surface, making explicit what had been implicit all evening. Raymond Foster was an outsider, unwelcome in this rarefied world, yet somehow he seemed to possess a confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. As the Fosters disappeared through the door with Sebastian, Dominic Winters scribbled furiously in his notebook. Whatever happened next, he knew his column had just found its headline, "Class Conflict Erupts at Blackwell's Winter Auction." What none of them yet realized was that the real drama of the evening was still to come, and it would center not on Victor Harrington's boorish behavior, but on Raymond Foster's true purpose in coming to Blackwell's, a purpose that Alessandra's whispered message had just confirmed to Sebastian's growing horror. The private office behind Blackwell's auction room was a study in understated luxury. Mahogany bookshelves lined with leather-bound auction catalogues dating back generations, a Chesterfield sofa in deep burgundy leather, an antique partner's desk that had once belonged to Sebastian's grandfather, the auction house's founder. The walls displayed smaller works from the Blackwell family's personal collection. Nothing ostentatious, but each piece carefully chosen to demonstrate both wealth and taste. Sebastian closed the door firmly behind them, shutting out the murmur of the auction continuing in the main hall. His composed facade had slipped, revealing tightly controlled anger beneath. "Mr. Foster," he said, not bothering to offer them seats, "perhaps you'd care to explain exactly what game you're playing." Raymond stood calmly in the center of the room, Claire at his side. "I'm not playing any game, Mr. Blackwell. I'm here to bid on Lot 37, as I've made clear from the beginning." "Yes, Lot 37. Twilight on the Seine," Sebastian replied. "A Monet with impeccable provenance. Or so we believed until approximately 2 minutes ago, when my assistant informed me of a rather disturbing discovery." He turned to Alessandra, who stood by the desk, clutching a tablet. "Show them." Alessandra turned the tablet around, displaying a scanned document, a yellowed insurance record from 1976. "This was in our supplementary provenance file," she explained. "It's a listing of artworks insured by the third owner of the Monet, Henri Beaumont." Claire stepped forward, studying the document closely. "And if you look at item 12, Alessandra continued, her professional tone at odds with the tension in the room, you'll see that Beaumont's collection included 2 Monet riverside scenes. One matches our Lot 37. The other is listed as Sunset Seine at Giverny, current location unknown." "2 very similar Monets," Sebastian said, watching Raymond's face carefully. "And according to our records, Beaumont sold one of them, our Twilight on the Seine, to the Dufresne family in 1977, who kept it until the current owner discovered it in their attic last year. But," Alessandra added, We've just found a catalogue from a 1977 exhibition at the Manchester City Gallery that lists a Monet, Twilight on the Seine, as on loan from the Foster collection. A heavy silence filled the room. "You believe there's been a mistake in the provenance," Raymond said. "It wasn't a question. A mistake would be the charitable interpretation," Sebastian replied coldly. "Art theft would be another." Claire bristled visibly. "That's an outrageous accusation. My grandfather—" "It's all right, Claire," Raymond interjected quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the folded newspaper clipping he had been carrying all evening. "Perhaps this will clarify matters." He carefully unfolded the yellowed paper and placed it on the desk. It was a local Manchester newspaper article dated September 18th, 1978. The headline read, "Local Industrialists' Art Collection Disputed in Bankruptcy Proceedings." The article detailed how Raymond Foster Sr., the current Raymond's father, had been forced to liquidate assets, including a significant art collection, when the family's textile mills collapsed. But there were allegations that certain pieces, including a Monet, had been removed from the collection before liquidators arrived. "My father was ruined," Raymond said simply. "The banks took everything, factories, homes, even family heirlooms. The only thing he managed to save was one painting, a painting that had been in our family since my grandfather purchased it directly from Monet during a visit to Giverny in 1897. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "You're claiming the Monet we're auctioning tonight belonged to your family?" "No," Raymond replied. "I'm saying there were indeed two very similar Monets in existence. Beaumont owned one, my family owned the other. Ours was called Dusk on the Seine. Subtle differences, but unmistakable to anyone who knew both works. When my father's business collapsed, Henri Beaumont, who had always coveted our painting, saw an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Sebastian asked, his tone skeptical but less hostile. Raymond's weathered face showed a flicker of old pain. "Beaumont offered to buy our Monet privately, for less than half its value, knowing my father was desperate. When my father refused, Beaumont suggested that perhaps the liquidators wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two paintings, that maybe the Foster's painting would be written off as a copy or merely missing." "Grandfather," Claire said quietly, touching his arm. Raymond covered her hand with his own. "It's all right. It's time the truth was known." He turned back to Sebastian. "What happened next nearly destroyed my father. Beaumont used his connections to suggest to the liquidators that our Monet was likely a forgery. He even produced documentation for his own painting to prove he owned the authentic one. And you believe the painting in tonight's auction is actually your family's painting, not Beaumont's," Sebastian said, the implication sinking in. "I know it is," Raymond replied. "The one found in the Dufresne attic, the one you're selling tonight, is Twilight on the Seine, Beaumont's painting, which means ours is still out there somewhere, still missing after all these years." Sebastian exchanged a glance with Alessandra. This was potentially explosive information, the kind that could cast doubt on the provenance of their star lot. "Just minutes before it was due to be auctioned, Mr. Foster," Sebastian said carefully, "while I sympathize with your family's history, I fail to see how this impacts tonight's auction. By your own admission, the painting we're selling isn't the one your family owned." "No, but its sale represents my best chance of finding ours," Raymond replied. "That's why I've come, not to disrupt your auction, but to finally trace what happened to our painting." "How?" Raymond looked Sebastian directly in the eye. "By purchasing Twilight on the Seine, I gain access to its complete provenance records, conservation history, and Beaumont's private correspondence about the painting. Documentation that might contain clues to what happened to ours. The Dufresnes were Beaumont's relatives. There might be letters, notes, something that reveals where our Dusk on the Seine ended up." The explanation was so unexpected, so devoid of the scandal Sebastian had feared, that he found himself momentarily speechless. He had anticipated accusations, threats of legal action, perhaps even an attempt to halt the auction. Instead, Raymond Foster had revealed a personal quest decades in the making, one that happened to coincide with Blackwell's business interests rather than threaten them. "So you genuinely intend to bid on the Monet?" Sebastian said slowly. "I do," Raymond confirmed. "Every penny my family has left, plus what I've saved over a lifetime of work, has gone toward this moment. I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Blackwell. I'm here to finish something that began over 40 years ago." Claire spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "My grandfather has spent his entire life trying to restore what was lost. The Foster mills employed thousands of people in Manchester. When they collapsed, it wasn't just our family that suffered. My great-grandfather built that business from nothing. My grandfather watched it all disappear, along with our family's honor. The painting is the last piece," Raymond added, "not for its monetary value, though that's considerable, but because it represents the truth, that the Fosters were wronged, not wrong." Sebastian studied the old man carefully. Despite his initial suspicions, he found himself believing Raymond's story. It had the ring of truth that no fabrication could match. More importantly for Sebastian's purposes, it meant Raymond Foster was indeed a serious bidder, with legitimate motivation and presumably significant financial backing. Yet he couldn't help but wonder if Raymond truly understood what he was up against. The Monet was expected to sell for well over its £12 million estimate. Museums, billionaire collectors, and investment consortiums had all expressed interest. Did this man in his worn tweed coat really have the resources to compete at that level? "Mr. Foster," Sebastian said, adopting a more conciliatory tone, "while I appreciate your candor, I have to ask, are you aware of the expected price range for Lot 37? Raymond nodded. "I am. And you still wish to participate in the bidding?" "That's why I'm here." Sebastian exchanged another glance with Alessandra, who gave a small nod. The verification of funds that Carlton had obtained was apparently substantial. Very. "Well," Sebastian decided, "we should return to the auction. Lot 37 will be coming up soon, and I'm sure you don't want to miss it." As they made their way back toward the auction room, Sebastian found himself reassessing Raymond Foster. The man was still an outsider, someone who didn't belong in Blackwell's rarefied world of wealth and taste, but he was not the disruptor Sebastian had feared. Instead, he was something potentially more interesting. A bidder with deep emotional investment in an item, exactly the kind of motivation that could drive prices to record heights. Sebastian allowed himself a small private smile. Perhaps Raymond Foster's presence at tonight's auction would prove beneficial after all. Nothing drove up bidding like competition, and nothing fueled competitive bidding like personal passion. Back in the Grand Hall, the auction had continued smoothly in their absence. Malcolm Reed was now presenting Lot 34, a set of rare Japanese woodblock prints that was generating lively interest among several bidders. Victor Harrington, Sebastian noted with relief, had been seated next to his father and appeared to have been subdued, at least temporarily. As Raymond and Claire returned to their seats, a fresh wave of whispers swept through the room. The confrontation with Victor, followed by their disappearance with Sebastian, had only heightened the mystery surrounding the Fosters. Dominic Winters, Sebastian noticed with irritation, had somehow maneuvered himself into a seat closer to the Fosters, and was watching them with undisguised interest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Malcolm announced as the Japanese prints were sold for well above their estimate, "we will take a brief intermission before proceeding to our final segment, which will include tonight's featured lot, number 37, Claude Monet's Twilight on the Seine." The timing was deliberate, a chance for anticipation to build, for potential bidders to collect themselves, and for Blackwell's staff to make last-minute calls to clients. who might have expressed interest but had not yet committed to bidding. As attendees rose for refreshments or stepped outside to make phone calls, Raymond remained seated, his expression contemplative. Claire leaned close, speaking softly in his ear, but he simply patted her hand reassuringly. Across the room, Harold Winfield Hayes conferred with his colleagues from the Guggenheim. The Countess studied her auction catalogue with renewed interest, making notations in the margin. Several auction house staff stood by telephones, prepared to represent remote bidders. The atmosphere had shifted subtly. What had begun as an ordinary, if exclusive, auction had transformed into something more charged, more unpredictable. And at the center of this change was Raymond Foster, the outsider who had endured mockery and confrontation without flinching, who had revealed a decades-old quest for justice without drama or histrionics, and who now sat calmly waiting for his moment to bid on a painting that represented not just art or investment, but vindication. The intermission drew to a close. Malcolm Reed returned to the podium, adjusting his bow tie with practiced precision. Sebastian took his place at the side of the room, where he could observe both the auctioneer and the bidders. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please return to your seats," Malcolm announced. "We are about to begin our final segment." As the audience settled, Sebastian caught Raymond's eye across the room. The old man gave him a slight nod, an acknowledgement between adversaries who had moved from suspicion to a kind of wary respect. The moment they had all been waiting for was about to arrive. Lot 37, Claude Monet's Twilight on the Seine, was about to take center stage, and Raymond Foster, after 40 years of waiting, was finally poised to make his bid. Ladies and gentlemen, we now continue with Lot 35, a magnificent Art Deco diamond and emerald bracelet by Cartier, circa 1925. Previously from the collection of the Duchess of Marlborough. We'll start the bidding at $95,000. Malcolm. Reed's voice carried through the grand hall with practiced precision. The auction had resumed its rhythm, the earlier disruption caused by Victor Harrington seemingly forgotten as the clientele refocused on the business at hand. Paddles rose and fell, the figures climbing steadily as Malcolm orchestrated the bidding. With the finesse of a conductor leading an orchestra, $100,000 from paddle number 42. Do I see $110,000? Another paddle lifted. $110,000 from paddle number 17. Thank you, sir. $120,000. The bracelet eventually sold for $175,000 to a telephone bidder, and Malcolm smoothly transitioned to Lot 36, a collection of first-edition Dickens novels bound in Moroccan leather. Throughout the proceedings, Raymond and Claire Foster remained still and attentive in their back-row seats. If Raymond was nervous about the approaching moment he had spent decades preparing for, he showed no sign of it. His weathered hands rested calmly on his knees, his posture relaxed yet dignified. Beside him, Claire seemed less composed, occasionally checking her watch or glancing around the room as if assessing the competition. From his position near the auctioneer's podium, Sebastian Blackwell maintained the appearance of professional detachment, but his attention repeatedly drifted to the Fosters. Their story had altered his perception of tonight's event. What had begun as an irritating disruption to his carefully managed auction had evolved into something potentially more significant, a human drama playing out amid the usual commerce of art and artifacts. Sebastian had discreetly informed Malcolm about Raymond's interest in Lot 37, not revealing the personal history behind it, but ensuring the auctioneer would be prepared for serious bidding from an unexpected quarter. Malcolm had simply nodded, unsurprised. In his 30 years conducting high-profile auctions, he had seen enough to know that wealth and apparent status were not always aligned. Some of the most aggressive bidders he had encountered over the decades had been the most unassuming in appearance, sold to paddle number 29 for $85,000. Malcolm announced as the Dickens collection found a new owner. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to Lot 37, the highlight of this evening's auction. A subtle shift rippled through the room. People who had been browsing their catalogues or quietly conversing with companions sat up straighter. Those who had stepped out for the previous lots returned to their seats. The energy in the grand hall noticeably intensified. Two white-gloved assistants carefully brought forward the Monet, positioning it on the easel beside Malcolm's podium. Even from a distance, the painting commanded attention. Monet's distinctive brushwork capturing the play of fading light on the Seine, the violet and amber hues of dusk reflected in the water, creating that sense of atmospheric magic that had made the Impressionist master's work so revolutionary and enduring. Claude Monet's Twilight on the Seine, oil on canvas, painted circa 1897, Malcolm began, his tone taking on the reverence the piece deserved. Authenticated by the Wildenstein Institute and featured in their catalogue raisonné, this exceptional work comes to us with impeccable provenance, having been rediscovered last year in the attic of the Dufresne family home in Normandy, where it had remained untouched for nearly 50 years. As Malcolm continued detailing the painting's history and significance, Sebastian observed the room. Harold Winfield Hayes, from the Guggenheim, was conferring with his colleague, likely finalizing their bidding strategy. The Countess had set aside her catalogue and sat with perfect posture, her expression revealing nothing of her intentions. 3 auction house staff stood ready by the telephones, representing remote bidders who preferred to remain anonymous but were serious enough to have placed substantial deposits to participate. And then there was Raymond Foster. Unlike the others, he wasn't strategizing or calculating. He simply gazed at the painting with an expression that mingled recognition, determination, and something deeper, a sense of homecoming perhaps, as if seeing an old friend after a long separation. Given the exceptional quality and rarity of this work, we will start the bidding at $8 million, Malcolm announced. The figure was substantial, but deliberately set below the estimated value to encourage initial participation. Sebastian knew from experience that serious bidders often held back at first, preferring to observe the field before committing themselves. Million, Malcolm repeated. Do I see $8 million to start? For a brief, tense moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate, calm, Harold Winfield Hayes raised his paddle. $8 million from paddle number 63. Thank you, sir. Do I see $8.5 million? A telephone bidder entered the fray, then another. The price climbed steadily. $9 million, $9.5 million, $10 million. The rhythm was familiar to everyone in the room, the dance of wealth and desire playing out as it had countless times before in auction houses around the world. At $10.5 million, the Countess finally joined the bidding, her single nod to Malcolm so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not watching for it. Her entry eliminated one of the telephone bidders, who declined to counter at $11 million, and through it all, Raymond Foster remained still, observing the proceedings with the patience of a man who had waited decades for this moment, and could wait. A few minutes more. $11.5 million from paddle number 63, Malcolm noted, as Harold raised his paddle again. Do I hear $12 million? The Countess nodded once more. The remaining telephone bidder stayed in at $12.5 million. Harold countered with $13 million. Sebastian maintained his professional composure, but inwardly he was pleased. The Monet was already exceeding its estimate, and the bidding showed no signs of slowing. If the pattern continued, they might be looking at a record sale for a Monet of this size and period. $13.5 million from the telephone, Malcolm announced. Against you, Mr. Winfield Hayes. Harold conferred briefly with his colleague, then reluctantly shook his head. The Guggenheim had reached its limit. $13.5 million from telephone bidder. Number 2, the Countess at $13.5 million. The Countess hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head. She, too, was out. 13.5 million on the telephone. Fair warning at 13.5 million. The Grand Hall had gone completely silent. This was the moment in every auction when tension peaked, when a high-value lot approached the point of sale, but last-minute bids remained possible. Malcolm raised his gavel, preparing to bring it down and conclude the sale. Selling at 13.5. 14 million. The voice came from the back of the room, clear and steady. Raymond Foster had finally made his move. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. All heads turned toward the back row, where Raymond sat with his paddle raised, his expression unchanged except for a new intensity in his gaze as he looked directly at the painting. Malcolm, ever the professional, recovered instantly. $14 million from paddle number 87. Thank you, sir, the telephone bidder responded. 14.5 million. Raymond didn't hesitate. 15 million. The room was utterly still now, the spectators watching with a combination of disbelief and fascination, as the man they had dismissed and mocked earlier now bid millions with the same calm confidence he might use to order a cup of tea. 15 million in the room, Malcolm confirmed. The bid is with paddle number 87 at $15 million. There was a pause as the telephone representative listened to his client. Then, with visible reluctance, he shook his head. The anonymous bidder had reached their limit. $15 million for the first time, Malcolm said, his gavel poised. 15 million for the second time. Sebastian watched, hardly daring to breathe. The Monet was about to sell for well above its estimate, a triumph for Blackwell's. Yet there was something bittersweet in the moment, a recognition that this transaction represented more than just a financial exchange for Raymond Foster. Fair warning at 15 million. Just as Malcolm prepared to bring down the gavel, another voice rang out from the middle of the room. 15.5 million. It was Victor Harrington. The collective shock was palpable. Victor, who had appeared subdued since his earlier outburst, now stood with his paddle raised, a challenging smirk directed toward Raymond Foster. 15.5 million from paddle number 21. Malcolm confirmed, his voice betraying no emotion despite the unexpected development. Lord Harrington, seated beside his son, appeared as stunned as everyone else. He grasped Victor's arm, whispering urgently, but Victor shook him off. "Victor," Lord Harrington hissed, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "what are you doing? We didn't come here for the Monet." "Changed my mind, father," Victor replied, his voice carrying in the hushed room. Suddenly developed an appreciation for impressionism. His eyes remained fixed on Raymond, the challenge unmistakable. Sebastian felt a knot form in his stomach. Victor's bid wasn't motivated by genuine interest in the painting. It was purely about humiliating Raymond Foster. Whether Victor actually had the means to cover such a bid was another question entirely, one that Sebastian, as the auction house representative, was professionally obligated to worry about. All eyes turned to Raymond. The old man's expression had not changed, but Claire leaned toward him, whispering urgently in his ear. After a moment, Raymond nodded once and raised his paddle again. 16 million. The figure hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. It was now well beyond the painting's estimated value, beyond what most experts would consider reasonable for a Monet of this size and period. This was no longer ordinary commerce. It had become something personal. Victor's smirk faltered slightly. He glanced at his father, who was shaking his head in warning, then back at Raymond. Perhaps he had expected the older man to back down, to admit defeat in front of the assembled elite of the art world. 16.5 million, Victor called out, his voice slightly less confident than before. Lord Harrington gripped his son's arm again, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Victor, stop this immediately. You cannot possibly. I can do what I want," Victor snapped, jerking his arm free. Malcolm Reed, ever the consummate professional, continued as if this were all perfectly normal. 16.5 million from paddle number 21. Do I hear 17 million? The room held its collective breath as Raymond Foster considered his response. The ordinary proceedings of the auction had been completely transformed. What had begun as a standard, high-value sale, following patterns familiar to everyone in the room, had evolved into a personal duel, one wealthy young man's spite against an older man's decades-long quest. The financial logic that typically governed such auctions had been abandoned. This was now about something more primal: pride, vindication, and the settlement of a score that had begun earlier that evening, but now represented something larger. A clash between different worlds, different values, different understandings of what truly mattered. As Raymond Foster prepared to respond, Sebastian found himself in the unusual position of no longer caring primarily about the final sale price. Instead, he was gripped by a simple human curiosity. How would this drama resolve itself? What price would Raymond Foster ultimately be willing to pay to reclaim not just a connection to a lost painting, but his family's honor and legacy? The question hung in the air, resonating through the grand hall like the lingering note of a struck bell. 16.5 million from paddle number 21. Do I hear 17 million? Malcolm Reed's gaze rested on Raymond Foster, as did every other pair of eyes in the room. The ordinary rhythm of the auction had been shattered by Victor Harrington's spiteful intervention. What should have been Raymond's moment of triumph, securing the painting that represented his family's honor after decades of waiting, had been transformed into yet another challenge, another obstacle to overcome. Claire gripped her grandfather's arm, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Grandfather," she whispered, "we discussed this. We set a limit." Raymond patted her hand gently, his weathered face calm despite the tension surrounding him. "Some things are beyond price, Claire." With deliberate slowness, he raised his paddle once more. 17 million. The collective intake of breath from the audience was audible. This was now officially extraordinary. A Monet of this size and period had never fetched such a sum at auction. The painting's artistic and historical value was significant, certainly, but the bidding had transcended market value and entered the realm of personal vendetta. Victor Harrington's face flushed with angry color. He had clearly expected his last bid to end the contest, to publicly humiliate the old man in the worn tweed coat who had dared to maintain his dignity in the face of Victor's earlier mockery. Now, faced with Raymond's continued resolve, Victor found himself in an unexpected predicament. Lord Harrington leaned close to his son, his voice low but intense. "Victor, this is absolute madness. You cannot possibly bid again. Even our family cannot afford to spend £17 million on a painting we don't even want, especially not out of petty spite." For a moment, Victor hesitated, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the fog of alcohol and arrogance that had driven his behavior all evening. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the hundreds of eyes upon him. The whispers already starting. The narrative was shifting. He was no longer the privileged aristocrat putting an upstart in his place. He was becoming the foolish young man who had been outmaneuvered by someone he had underestimated. 17.5 million, Victor called out, his voice carrying a note of desperation now rather than confidence. Lord Harrington closed his eyes briefly in dismay. Sebastian Blackwell tensed, a flicker of professional concern crossing his features. As auctioneer, Malcolm Reed was obligated to accept all bids in good faith, but the auction house was ultimately responsible for ensuring that successful bidders could actually pay. If Victor was bidding beyond his means out of wounded pride, it could create serious complications. 17.5 million from paddle number 21, Malcolm confirmed, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the unprecedented situation. The bid is with paddle number 21 at 17.5 million. Raymond Foster sat motionless for several long seconds, his clear blue eyes fixed not on Victor or the auctioneer, but on the painting itself, the swirls of violet and amber capturing the sign at twilight, the masterful brushwork that had prompted his grandfather to purchase a similar work from Monet himself so many decades ago. In that moment, he seemed to be communing with the painting, or perhaps with the ghosts of his past. His father, his grandfather, the generations of Fosters who had built something from nothing, lost everything, and now, through him, might reclaim a piece of their legacy. When Raymond finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried throughout the now silent hall. "I didn't come here tonight looking for confrontation, Mr. Harrington," he said, addressing Victor directly. "I came for a painting that might help me find a piece of my family's history, that's all." Victor's expression wavered between embarrassment and defiance. "Then perhaps you should have stayed where you belong instead of coming here," he retorted, though with less conviction than before. Raymond nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a point. "Perhaps, but sometimes a man has to step outside his usual world to set things right." Then, with the same deliberate calm he had shown all evening, Raymond raised his paddle once more. But instead of continuing the incremental increases that had characterized the bidding thus far, he made a move that stunned everyone present. 20 million. The figure landed in the silent room like a thunderclap. Not just another bid, but a decisive statement. A clear message that Raymond Foster would not be deterred by spite or social snobbery or anything else that stood between him and his purpose. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. Even Malcolm Reed, with all his years of experience handling high-stakes auctions, seemed momentarily at a loss. Victor Harrington stared at Raymond, his earlier smirk completely gone, replaced by disbelief. Lord Harrington seized this moment of stunned silence to grip his son's arm firmly. "Not another penny, Victor," he hissed. "I forbid it. You've made enough of a spectacle of yourself and our family tonight." Whether it was his father's command or the sheer shock of Raymond's unexpected leap in bidding, Victor remained silent. Malcolm Reed, recovering his professional composure, spoke into the tense quiet. "I have $20 million from paddle number 87, he announced. "That's $20 million in the room. Do I hear 20.5 million? Victor's gaze darted between his father's forbidding expression and Raymond's steady one. For a moment, it seemed he might defy his father and continue the bidding war. But something in Raymond's calm certainty, the untroubled confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why, finally penetrated Victor's pride. With visible reluctance, Victor lowered his paddle and slumped back in his seat. 20 million for the first time, Malcolm continued. 20 million for the second time. The Grand Hall held its collective breath. This was now officially the highest price ever paid at Blackwell's for a single artwork. A record that would make headlines in the morning papers and art journals around the world. Fair warning at 20 million. Malcolm's gavel hung in the air for one final moment of suspense. Sold to paddle number 87 for 20 million. The crack of the gavel echoed through the hall, making official what everyone had witnessed. Raymond Foster, the outsider in worn tweed who had been mocked and dismissed when he first entered Blackwell's, had just purchased one of the most valuable paintings ever sold at the auction house. The typical polite applause that followed a major sale was hesitant. At first, then grew stronger as the reality of what they had witnessed sank in. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a moment of triumph, of vindication, of a wrong partly righted after decades. Claire embraced her grandfather, tears glistening in her eyes. Raymond returned the embrace briefly, then straightened in his seat, his expression one of quiet satisfaction rather than victory. He had not come to defeat Victor Harrington or to prove anything to the elite gathered in the Grand Hall. He had come for something that mattered to him, and he had succeeded. Sebastian Blackwell made his way through the room toward Raymond, his professional mask firmly in place, despite the tumult of emotions beneath. Relief at the successful sale, curiosity about the man who had defied all expectations, and a grudging respect for the dignity with which Raymond had conducted himself throughout the evening. "Congratulations, Mr. Foster," Sebastian said, extending his hand. "A remarkable acquisition." Raymond stood to shake Sebastian's hand, the gesture bridging worlds that had seemed impossibly distant just hours before. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. Your auction house has lived up to its reputation. We'll need to complete the paperwork, of course, and discuss arrangements for payment and collection of the painting." "Of course," Raymond agreed. "And I'd like to review all the documentation you have regarding the painting's provenance, as we discussed earlier." Sebastian nodded. "My office is at your disposal. Perhaps tomorrow morning would be convenient. I imagine you've had quite enough excitement for one evening." "Tomorrow morning will be fine," Raymond confirmed. He turned to Claire. "Shall we, my dear? I think we've accomplished what we came for." As Raymond and Claire prepared to leave, moving toward the exit with unhurried dignity, conversation erupted throughout the Grand Hall. The evening's unexpected drama would provide material for gossip and speculation for months to come. Already, Dominic Winters was making notes for what promised to be a sensational column about class, wealth, and the true meaning of value in the art world. Victor Harrington remained in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, his earlier bravado completely deflated. Lord Harrington signaled to a Blackwell staff member, likely arranging for a discreet exit to avoid further embarrassment. The Countess, observing it all with the detached interest of someone who had seen many social dramas play out over her long life, caught Raymond's eye as he passed. She inclined her head slightly in a gesture that conveyed not just acknowledgement, but a kind of respect, one serious collector recognizing another, regardless of appearances or background. At the door, Raymond paused for a moment, turning back, to look once more at the painting that had drawn him to Blackwell's. Twilight on the Seine glowed under the careful lighting, its beauty undimmed by the drama that had surrounded its sale. For Raymond, it represented not just a valuable artwork, or even a link to his family's lost painting. It represented a principle that some things once lost could be found again, that wrongs, even those decades old, could be at least partially righted, that dignity in the end mattered more than social status or the opinions of others. With a slight nod, as if saying farewell to an old friend, Raymond turned and walked out of Blackwell's, Claire at his side. As the heavy doors swung closed behind them, they left behind a room full of people who would never forget the night when an old man in worn tweed had walked into their exclusive world and changed it forever with a single decisive action, a bid that represented not just the purchase of a painting, but the reclamation of something far more valuable, his family's honor and his own unshakable sense of purpose. Outside, the London night was cool and clear, the streets of Mayfair quieter. Now, as the evening deepened, the same doorman who had eyed Raymond skeptically when he arrived now held the door with deferential respect, murmuring, "Good evening, sir," as he passed. "Well, grandfather," Claire said as they walked down the steps to the street, "you did it, after all these years." Raymond smiled, the lines in his weathered face softening. "We did it, Claire. Your research, your support. I couldn't have done it without you." "Do you really think Beaumont's papers will lead us to our family's painting?" "I believe they might," Raymond replied. "And even if they don't, we've taken a step towards setting things right. Your great-grandfather would be proud." As they reached the pavement, a black cab pulled up, not the luxury car that might be expected for someone who had just spent $20 million on a painting, but the ordinary transport of ordinary Londoners. Some habits, it seemed, remained unchanged, despite extraordinary circumstances. Raymond opened the door for Claire, then paused for one last look at Blackwell's illuminated facade before joining her in the cab. His decisive action had not just won him a painting, it had settled a debt to the past and opened a door to the future, a future where the Foster name might once again be associated with dignity and honor rather than failure and loss. And that, Raymond reflected as the cab pulled away into the London night, was worth every penny of $20 million. 3 months had passed since the now legendary Blackwell winter auction. Spring had come to London, bringing with it the pale green buds of new life in the city's parks and the promise of renewal after the long winter. The Blackwell Auction House appeared much as it always had, its neoclassical facade impeccably maintained, its reputation for handling the finest art and artifacts intact. Yet within its walls, something had subtly shifted. The story of Raymond Foster and his record-breaking purchase had spread throughout the art world, becoming the kind of tale that auction house employees told to new recruits, that art dealers referenced in negotiations, that collectors discussed over champagne at gallery openings. Sebastian Blackwell stood in his office, adjusting his cufflinks as he prepared for the day's appointments. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the space that had been occupied by Blackwells for 3 generations. On his desk sat the morning's Financial Times, open to a feature article in the arts section. Foster Foundation opens gallery in Manchester's former industrial district. The article detailed how Raymond Foster had established a public gallery in the renovated main building of what had once been the Foster textile mill. The centerpiece of the collection was Monet's Twilight on the Seine, but the gallery also featured works on loan from major museums and pieces by contemporary northern artists. Most notably, the gallery offered free art education programs for local school children and subsidized studio space for emerging artists from working-class backgrounds. Sebastian was reading the article for the second time when Alessandra knocked on his open door. "Mr. Foster and his granddaughter have arrived for their appointment," she announced. Sebastian nodded. "Show them in, please." Moments later, Raymond and Claire Foster entered the office. Raymond looked much as he had on that memorable night, dressed in simple, well-worn clothing that spoke of practicality rather than status. Claire, by contrast, had exchanged her simple black dress for a professional suit, her manner that of someone who had found her purpose. "Mr. Foster, Miss Foster," Sebastian greeted them, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Blackwell," Raymond replied with a nod. "Good of you to see us on such short notice." "Please sit down." Sebastian indicated the chairs opposite, his desk. "I was just reading about your gallery. Quite an ambitious project." Raymond smiled faintly. "It seems fitting. The mills once brought art and beauty into people's homes through textiles. Now the same building can introduce them to another kind of beauty." "I understand the response has been remarkable," Sebastian said. 5,000 visitors in the first week alone, according to the article. "People are hungry for access to art," Claire explained, "especially in communities that have traditionally been excluded from it." There was a moment of silence as Sebastian regarded them thoughtfully. The meeting today wasn't a social call. They had requested it specifically to discuss a matter of some importance. Yet there was no tension in the room, only a sense of mutual respect that had been hard-won on that winter night. "I believe you mentioned on the phone that you've made a discovery," Sebastian prompted. Raymond nodded, reaching into his familiar, worn messenger bag. "We have indeed, Mr. Blackwell, and we thought you should be the first to know, given your auction house's involvement." He withdrew a folder and placed it on Sebastian's desk. "As you'll recall, my primary interest in purchasing Twilight on the Seine was to gain access to Henri Beaumont's complete records. correspondence, transaction histories, personal notes, anything that might shed light on what happened to my family's painting, Dusk on the Seine. Yes, I remember, Sebastian confirmed. We provided all the documentation we had, as promised. You did, Claire acknowledged, but it wasn't until we began sorting through the Dufresne family archives, which were included in the sale, that we found something extraordinary. Sebastian leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued. What did you find? Raymond opened the folder and removed a yellowed envelope. This was hidden in a compartment in the backing of Twilight on the Seine. We discovered it during the conservation assessment before installing the painting in our gallery. From the envelope, he carefully extracted several sheets of brittle paper, a handwritten letter in French, dated October 1978. It's a confession of sorts, Raymond explained, written by Henri Beaumont to his nephew Jean-Paul Dufresne, with explicit instructions that it was to be read only after Beaumont's death. He died in 1979, but apparently the letter remained sealed and hidden until now. Sebastian accepted the translated copy Claire offered him and began to read. My dear Jean-Paul, by the time you read this, I will be gone from this world and beyond the reach of earthly consequences. This fact alone gives me the courage to confess what I have done, though I leave it to you to decide what actions, if any, this confession should prompt. In 1978, when the Foster textile empire in England collapsed, I saw an opportunity to acquire something I had coveted for decades. The Fosters owned a Monet, Dusk on the Seine, purchased directly from the master himself by the first Raymond Foster during a visit to Giverny. It was remarkably similar to my own Monet, Twilight on the Seine, the differences discernible only to the most educated eye. When the banks moved to liquidate the Foster assets, I used my connections and reputation to cast doubt on the authenticity of their painting. I suggested it was likely a copy of my own authenticated work. The liquidators, not being art experts and facing the pressure of a complex bankruptcy, accepted my assessment without the rigorous examination the painting deserved. I then arranged, through intermediaries, to purchase the supposedly questionable painting for a fraction of its true value. The funds went to the creditors, not to the Fosters themselves, who by then had lost everything. But here is my true confession, Jean-Paul. I did not keep the Foster painting separate from my own. Instead, I created a deception that has persisted for nearly 4 decades. The painting you have inherited, which hangs in your attic and which you have always known as Twilight on the Seine, is in fact the Foster painting, Dusk on the Seine. My own painting was sold secretly to a private collector in South America, the transaction handled with the utmost discretion to avoid any record that might reveal my duplicity. I have lived with this knowledge, and with the Foster painting, the evidence of my dishonesty, all these years. Why am I telling you this now? Perhaps to unburden my soul before meeting my Maker. Perhaps because, in my final days, I find myself haunted by the expression on the elder Foster's face when he was forced to surrender his family's treasure. Whatever my motivation, the truth is now yours to carry. The painting you possess is rightfully a Foster painting. Whether you choose to reveal this fact or maintain the fiction I created is your decision. I have taken the coward's path by ensuring this revelation comes only after I am beyond earthly judgment. Your loving uncle, Henri Sebastian, looked up from the letter, momentarily speechless. The implications were extraordinary. The painting that had sold for 20 million at his auction house was not what everyone had believed it to be. More incredibly, Raymond Foster had unknowingly purchased his own family's painting, the very artwork he had been searching for all these years. This is remarkable, Sebastian finally said. Have you authenticated these claims? Claire nodded. We've had the letter verified by experts, and we've conducted technical analysis of the painting itself. There are subtle differences between twilight and dusk, documented in old exhibition catalogues, differences that match what we now possess. It's beyond doubt. The painting we purchased is actually our family's lost Dusk on the Seine. All these years, Raymond said quietly, searching for something that was hidden in plain sight. There's a certain poetry to it, don't you think? Sebastian studied the older man's face, expecting to see triumph or vindication. Instead, he saw only a serene acceptance, the peace of a man who had completed a long journey and found what he had been seeking. "What will you do with this information?" Sebastian asked. Legally, the sale was valid, regardless of the painting's true identity, but morally, this revelation changes everything about the provenance. "That's partly why we've come to see you," Claire explained. "We believe in transparency. The Foster Gallery will be updating the painting's documentation to reflect its true history, including Beaumont's deception and the remarkable journey it took to return to the Foster family." Raymond leaned forward slightly. "But we also wanted to discuss a proposition with you, Mr. Blackwell, one that might benefit us both." "I'm listening," Sebastian replied. "The story of this painting, its loss and recovery, the deception and ultimate homecoming, is compelling. We believe it would make an extraordinary centerpiece for an exhibition about art, provenance, and justice. We're proposing a joint venture between the Foster Gallery and Blackwell's, a special exhibition that would travel to both London and Manchester." Sebastian raised his eyebrows, intrigued despite himself. "An unusual partnership." "Perhaps," Claire acknowledged. "But think of the opportunities it presents. Blackwell's could expand its audience beyond the traditional collector's market. Our gallery could benefit from your expertise and connections, and together we could tell a story that transcends the usual narratives about art ownership. A story about how value isn't just in the price tag," Raymond added. "It's in the history, the meaning, the connection between people and what they create." Sebastian was silent for a moment, turning the proposal over in his mind. The traditional part of him, the part that had been raised to maintain the exclusivity of Blackwell's, to serve only the elite of the art world, was hesitant. But another part, the part that had watched Raymond Foster's dignity in the face of mockery and his determination in pursuing what mattered to him, saw the potential for something new and meaningful. "It would be unprecedented for Blackwell's," he said finally. "Most worthwhile things are unprecedented at first," Raymond replied with a small smile. Sebastian found himself returning the smile. "I'll need to discuss it with our board, of course, but speaking personally, I find the idea intriguing." They talked for another hour, outlining possibilities, addressing potential challenges, finding common ground despite their different backgrounds and perspectives. By the time Raymond and Claire rose to leave, the broad strokes of an agreement had taken shape. Not just an exhibition, but a new kind of collaboration that might bridge worlds that had long been separate. At the door, Raymond paused. "There's one more thing you should know, Mr. Blackwell. Victor Harrington came to see me last week." Sebastian couldn't hide his surprise. "Victor? What did he want?" "To apologize, as it happens. Quite sincerely, too." Raymond's expression was thoughtful. "He's volunteered to help with our education program in Manchester. Says he wants to learn about art from a different perspective." "That's unexpected," Sebastian admitted. "People can surprise you," Raymond said simply, "when given the chance." After they had gone, Sebastian returned to his desk and looked again at the newspaper article about the Foster Gallery. The photograph showed Raymond standing beside the Monet, his family's Monet as it turned out, with a group of schoolchildren gathered around him, their faces bright with interest as he explained something about the painting. It was an image that would have been impossible to imagine on that winter night when Raymond first walked into Blackwell's and was nearly turned away because of his appearance. The journey from that moment to this one contained lessons that went far beyond the art world, lessons about judgment, perseverance, and the true meaning of value. Sebastian picked up his phone. "Alessandra, please schedule a board meeting for next week. There's something important I need to propose." As he replaced the receiver, his gaze fell on a quote printed beneath the newspaper photograph, words attributed to Raymond Foster at the gallery's opening. "Art doesn't belong to the wealthy or the privileged. It belongs to everyone who can see beauty and truth in it. Our job isn't to possess it, but to share it." Sebastian had spent his life in the business of selling beautiful things to people who could afford them. It had never occurred to him that there might be another way to think about art, not as property to be acquired, but as a legacy to be shared. Raymond Foster, the outsider who had walked into his auction house in worn tweed and dusty boots, had taught him that. Outside Sebastian's window, spring sunshine illuminated the streets of Mayfair. In Manchester, that same sunshine would be falling on the renovated Foster Mill, where an old man was sharing his family's recovered treasure with a new generation. The painting had found its way home at last, and in doing so had built an unexpected bridge between two worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. Sometimes, Sebastian reflected, the most valuable things in life were not what you gained, but what you learned along the way. And sometimes the most important revelations came from the most unexpected sources, even from a man who didn't look like he belonged, until he proved that belonging was about much more than appearances. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.